Daf Yomi, Tractate, Chullin, page 33b. We left off with the last line in the Mishnah where it said that this Mishnah, the last line of the Gemara in the previous Amud, last line where it said this Mishnah is not in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Meir, as we learned in a Mishnah, Para 11.5. And now we're on the top of 33b, our daily Amud. The Amud of this video. Which is a daily daf of 33. And 33b, top of the page, Kol hata'un. Kol hata'un bias mayim midivrei soifri mitam yas hakodesh. Upoisel es truma muta b'chulin uvemaser dirmer. With regard to anything that by rabbinic law requires entry into water, meaning either immersion or ritual washing of the hands, although it is pure by Torah law, it is accorded secondary impurity. Therefore, such an item renders sacrificial food impure, meaning that the sacrificial food becomes impure and transmits impurity to other sacrificial food, and disqualifies truma, meaning that it renders the truma itself impure, but not to the extent that the truma can render other truma impure. And it is permitted for non-sacred food and for second tithe produce to come in contact with such an item, and no impurity is thereby transmitted. This is the statement of Rabbi Meir. And the rabbis prohibit items that require entry into water from coming in contact with the second tithe produce, as they hold that the produce is thereby rendered impure. According to the rabbis, the status of second tithe produce is more stringent than that of non-sacred food. The second tithe produce assumes third-degree impurity upon contact with an item of second-degree impurity, which is in accordance with the opinion of the Mishnah. Maskef lo Rav Shimi bar Ashi mimai tilmad kan liplik rabonan alei Meir and b'chias meiser. Rav Shimi bar Ashi objects to this interpretation of that Mishnah. From where is it clear that it is contact with the rabbis? It is contact the rabbis prohibited. Perhaps the rabbis disagree with Rabbi Meir only with regard to a person with second-degree impurity partaking of the second tithe produce, but with regard to contact of an individual with second-degree impurity with the second tithe produce, or as eating non-sacred food, they do not disagree. In this case, the Mishnah is a case involving contact with the flesh of the slaughtered animal, from the fact that it teaches they may be eaten with ritually impure hands, in the passive form, and not one may eat them with impure hands. Are we not dealing with a case where another with impure hands fed him, but the one eating it was ritually pure and did not touch it? Therefore, the case in the Mishnah here, which indicates that it is forbidden for one with impure hands to touch the flesh if it has come in contact with the blood, cannot be referring to an animal purchased in Jerusalem with second tithe money. The reason is that in that case the rabbis concede that contact with second tithe produce, even produce rendered susceptible to ritual impurity by the blood, is permitted for one whose hands are impure with second degree ritual impurity. Elo amar papa hachobidayim tchilos askinan v'Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar hi ditanya ein yadayim tchilos Chullin. Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar Omer Mishum Rabbi Meir Yadayim Tchilos Chullin Ushnios Truma. Rather, Rav Papa said here in the Mishnah we are dealing with hands that are impure with first degree ritual impurity, which render even non-sacred food impure. And the Mishnah is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, as is taught in a Braise. In those cases where hands have first degree impurity, it is not that they render non-sacred food impure, rather it means that they impart to truma and sacrificial food second degree impurity rather than third degree impurity. Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar says, in the name of Rabbi Meir, in those cases where hands have first degree impurity, it means that they render non-sacred food impure. And in those cases where hands have second degree impurity, it means that they invalidate truma and impart it to third degree impurity. Trilos lechulin in. The truma lo. Trilos av lechulin. Shnios truma in lechulin lo. The Gemara asks, did Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar say that in those cases where hands have first degree impurity with regard to non-sacred food, yes, they render it impure, but with regard to truma, hands do not render it impure? The Gemara answers, this is what Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar is saying. In those cases where hands have first degree impurity, it means that they render even non-sacred food impure, and all the more so they render truma impure. But in those cases where hands have second degree impurity, it means that with regard to truma, yes, the hands invalidate truma and impart third degree impurity, but with regard to non-sacred food, hands do not render it impure. In Titania, hichnis yadav lebeis hamenuga, yadav techilos, tiv Rabbi Akiva, chonoibim yadav shnios. The Gemara asks, and are there cases where hands assume first degree impurity? The Gemara answers yes, as it is taught in the Mishnah in Yadayim 3:1. If one inserts his hands into a leper's house, see Leviticus 14:33-53, his hands assume first degree impurity, as though his entire body entered the house. This is the statement of Rabbi Akiva, and the rabbis say his hands assume second degree impurity. The Gemara elaborates. Everyone agrees that, in principle, partial entry into a leper's house is not characterized as entry in terms of rendering one who enters impure. Therefore, one who inserted his hands into the house is not impure by Torah law. And here, it is with regard to a rabbinic decree that renders his hands impure that they disagree. The sages issued a decree that if one inserted his hands into a leper's house, his hands are impure due to the impurity by Torah law that one assumes when he enters the house with his entire body. The objective of the decree is to prevent him from entering the leper's house. One sage, Rabbi Akiva, holds that when the sages issued the decree, they determined that the status of his hands inserted into the house was like the status of his body that enters the house, first degree impurity. And one sage, the rabbis, holds that the sages rendered the status of hands inserted into the house like the status of hands in general, with regard to which they issued a decree of second degree impurity, even if they had been washed. The Gemara asks, and why did Rav Papa interpret the Mishnah in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar? Let Rav Papa interpret the Mishnah in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Akiva, who says if one inserts his hands into a leper's house, his hands assume first degree impurity. The Gemara answers, perhaps when Rabbi Akiva says that one's hands assume first degree impurity, that statement applies only in case of truma and sacrificial food, which are stringent, but with regard to non-sacred food, perhaps hands are impure only with second degree impurity. The Gemara objects and let hands also be impure only with second degree impurity, and the Mishnah could still be in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Akiva. As we heard that Rabbi Akiva says, an item of second degree impurity imparts third degree impurity to non-sacred items. Titznan bo bayom darash Rabbi Akiva v'chol kli cheres v'goymer yitma tomei lo nemar ela yitma letamei acherim limed al kibkar sheni shvoise shlishi b'chulin. As we learned in the Mishnah, Sota 27b. On that day, when Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah was appointed Nasi in Yavne, Rabbi Akiva taught, and every earthenware vessel into which any of them falls, whatever is in it shall be impure, and you shall break it. Leviticus 11:33. With regard to the item that rendered impure in the vessel, it is not stated it is impure. Rather, the term it shall be impure, yitzma, is stated, indicating that the item has the capacity to transmit impurity to other items. This verse teaches about a loaf with second degree impurity that had been rendered impure in the airspace of an earthenware vessel in which there was a creeping animal that through contact and renders non-sacred food impure with third degree ritual impurity. The Gemara explains perhaps the statement that non-sacred food becomes impure with third degree ritual impurity applies only with regard to impurity by Torah law, for example, creeping animal. With regard to impurity by rabbinic law, for example, purity of hands, that is not the halacha. Amar Rabbi Elazar, Amar Rabbi Yehoshua. Hacha b'chulin shinasu al taras hakodesh askinan udela Rabbi Yehoshua d'Tanya Rabbi Eliezer Omer ha'oichel ochel rishon sheni shlishi. Rabbi Elazar said that Rabbi Yehoshua said a third explanation of the Mishnah. Here we are dealing with a case of non-sacred food items that were prepared on the level of purity of sacrificial food, and the Mishnah is not in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yehoshua, as it is taught in the Mishnah in Tarot 2:2. Rabbi Eliezer says, one who eats food with first degree ritual impurity assumes first degree impurity. One who eats food with second degree impurity, ritual impurity, assumes second degree impurity. One who eats food with third degree impurity assumes third degree impurity. Rabbi Yehoshua Omer ha'ochel rishon v'sheni shlishi sheni lekodesh v'sheni letroma. The Mishnah continues. Rabbi Yehoshua says, one who eats food with first degree or second degree impurity assumes second degree impurity. One with second degree impurity who comes into contact with truma disqualifies it but does not render it impure. One who eats food with third degree impurity assumes second degree impurity vis-a-vis sacrificial food, meaning his contact with sacrificial food renders it impure with the capacity to transmit impurity to other sacrificial food, but does not assume second degree impurity vis-a-vis truma, and his contact with truma does not disqualify it. Eating an item that has third degree impurity is feasible only in the case of non-sacred food as partaking of impure truma, or sacrificial food is prohibited. Generic non-sacred food cannot contract third degree impurity at all. Therefore, the case of one who eats food that has third degree impurity is rendering specifically to non-sacred food items that were prepared on the level of purity of truma. Al taharas truma in al taharas hakodesh lo kasova chulin shinas on taharas hakodesh les behu shlishi. The Gemara infers from Rabbi Yehoshua's statement that if one prepares items as if their level of purity were on the level of purity of truma, then yes, they have a status like truma. But if one prepares items as if their level of purity were on the level of purity of sacrificial food, they do not have the status of sacrificial food, and such items would not contract their degree impurity. This indicates that Rabbi Yehoshua holds that non-sacred food items that were prepared on the level of purity of sacrificial food. Do not assume certain degree impurity. The Gemara objects. Let us interpret the Mishnah.